that it's for kids now on the YouTube.
Because there's a YouTube Kids. Like it's a whole separate app. It's just called slime videos.
I bet you have a lot of fun with it. Okay, so with that, and so the thing was, for tribal members, the United States promised to care for American Indians forever. But we're not going to quite get to the beast today. That'll be tomorrow. Darn it.
What?
But they called, the United States government called about the issue about now what with American Indians on reservations? What's going to happen? This kind of goes back to a Jeffersonian idea that they'll someday be ready to get involved or ready to enter white civilization. Yes, it is intensely racist, and they literally called it the, there we go, the Indian problem, which is a horrific name. The Indian problem. And the idea was to assimilate American Indians into white culture. Basically destroy their previous culture. Destroy the tribe. That was a big one. We could destroy the tribes. Then they have a chance to become like white people. In fact, their goal was, we'll turn them into white farmers. That's what they said, white farmers. That Jeffersonian idea of yeoman farmers. So you see a lot of pictures of this kind of propaganda showing American Indians, and they would say something horrible like savages, civilized. We should remind you of that positive good theory of slavery. Once you start differentiating people by color, it went to, outside of slavery, to other groups. Of course, American Indians were enslaved too. And this was a very common statement. Kill them off, save them out. We'll make them into small farmers. Now, this is intensely racist by saying, therefore, it's implying if you got to change them, hopefully make them into white farmers, you're saying that people who are not white are inferior. And secondly, its very idea is racist because they're not white. They're not of European ancestry. And so that alone shows that this idea was crazy, and it's a horrible term. It's absolutely awful in so many ways, but the connotations in the 20th century are going to be terrifying. That means to this day. Because in World War II, when Germany conquered Poland and Yugoslavia, but the biggie was the western part of the Soviet Union, the vast majority of the Jews in the world lived there. There was no Israel there. They lived there. And the Nazi Germany's plan was for them to drive Jews out of the country. We can't drive Jews out of your country when you're at total war for their very survival. Literally a war of annihilation. So they called that issue of what to deal with all these Jews now in areas that they have conquered and holding at gunpoint, the Jewish problem. That's what they called it. And in 1942, that's what they came up with, the final solution for the Jewish problem, which was what? And the Holocaust. Which that's when we're coming in the 1960s, but yeah, the mass murder of the Jews, which they're already kind of doing, but this would become an organized killing. And yes, Hitler greatly admired the racial policies of the United States, said it many times, and this is a connotation that we should be quite concerned about that exists in the United States. There's reasons why we have to talk about this. Things would be perfect if we didn't have these problems, but we do, and there are issues today. And the only way to solve them, or even know there's a problem and what caused it, is to know about things like this. And that's where we get to, what do? Well, we will help the Indians by destroying their way of life. It's called the Dawes Act. And the Dawes Act would be the final knife in the body, literally. Nail in the coffin is what they meant to say, that it came out knife. What the plan was, we'll make them small farmers. And what we'll do is, this is the US government, they're thinking, this is what we'll do. We will, 1887. Thank you for asking, because I forgot to say it. 1887. So it's right before Wounded Knee, but it's going to take over the next 20 years. I know when the sneeze comes. Are you one that comes in twos?
No, I just have really bad sneezes.
If I sneeze once, I sneeze twice.
My mom says I have to sneeze.
But they have to give up their membership in the tribes. Totally give it up.
Oh.
So therefore also lose the aid from the government. And in return, they'll get a homestead. 160 acres, 80 acres for a single person. With the idea that in 20 years, they'll be an independent farmer and they'll own their land. So they were going to divvy up the reservations into homesteads. And then they'll give it to people renouncing their tribal allegiance. And the thought was, see, we'll drive the Indian out. And this is actually an Indian school, but I think you probably see the problem with this. Most tribal members, especially in the 1880s and 1890s, knew nothing about farmers, did not want to give up not only the only life they knew, but what little they have of their previous life that had been destroyed, and to give that up for something that's unknown. And they didn't know how to farm, and all these areas were too dry to farm anyways. So what happened was, it was very clear that all these homesteads in the reservation, they just divvied the whole reservation up, not going to be taken. And so who do they open up the reservations to? To whites. Non-reservation members, almost all white, and they open it up and they can start claiming reservations. And you can imagine what Indian agents did. Indian agents realizing, ooh, this is a way to make money. And they started holding back good land, like land in bottom land along creeks that have water and good fertile soil. They would hold that back and give the driest and worst soil to tribal members, and then sell the good land, or give it to white homesteaders, which a lot of them were speculators, and then take money under the table. You get what I mean by that? Make a bribe, sell. So the best land in almost all the reservations are going to go to whites. And pretty soon they just said, well, the Indians don't want them, we'll just give them to whites, period. And this triggered a whole series of land rushes, most famously in Oklahoma, where whites would race into areas that were originally Indian territory, and they would claim land. They would race in and claim it. There have been famous movies about this. They always make it very dramatic. But the whole story was, you better get there sooner than later or you lose your land. And that's how come Oklahoma is called the Sooner State. From these people land rushing in and taking the land from the people it was originally supposed to go to. That's why the University of Oklahoma is the Sooners. That's their nickname. And if you ever heard that and wonder, that makes no sense. What does that even mean? That's get there sooner than later to get your land. And after 20 years, many of the homesteads that did go to tribal members all over the country, they didn't make it. And they were sold to whom? And today, 50% of all the land on reservations are owned by non-tribal members. 50%. And almost all of it's good land. So I told you I had friends that lived near the Northern County Reservation when I was growing up. The best farmland, this is really good land for ranching, by the way. The Northern Cheyenne Reservation, all the best land, all the best ranches owned by non-tribal members. They're not Cheyenne. The Flathead Reservation is kind of shocking. It's over 70% of the land in the Flathead Reservation, non-tribal members. So some of that land's quite lucrative. It's not owned by the tribe. So what's going to happen to those tribal members on the reservation after 20 years of the Dawes Act? What do they have left? Nothing. Now remember, they have nothing. And after 20 years, they even have less. Because most of the good land now is owned by somebody else. So the money that would have stayed in the reservation is leaving. And therefore, what's the poverty rate on reservations today? On average, it's well over 50%. Most are over 70% poverty rate. The Rocky Boy reservation is like 85% poverty. And you go on these reservations and you think, well, why are they, why not just clear your neighborhoods or this? And people say that without knowledge, and it always infuriates me. There are reasons why there's a lack of hope there. The people don't think the future matters. Why there's such alcohol problems, for example, or sky high suicide rates. We're talking about that. Part of the reason Montana's so high is the reservations. Why? They had nothing there. And that was policy. And the original policy was, we're helping them. And first off, that wasn't necessarily helping them, but then it was immediately they cheated and took it all. There are reasons why that happens. Remember, this should remind you a little about what happened to former slaves. Does that sound familiar? Same kind of thing. There are reasons. There's a history. There's a legacy. Which question?
So on reservations stuff, they have like their own laws.
Yeah, because remember we talked about this way back in Indian removal?
Yeah.
Cherokee versus Georgia said that they're dependent domestic nations. So they're technically independent, so state law doesn't totally apply. They have now, in fact, this is a big deal. An attempt during the New Deal, which has the awkward name, the Indian New Deal, very awkward name, I know, but under the Roosevelt administration to try to give them more rights, that's why there's more individual law there, but didn't do anything about the poverty issue, very little about it. But that's why there are kind of separate laws, and that's why I remember as a kid, when I go with my friends who were, a couple were Cheyenne, but we go to the Northern Cheyenne Reservation to get bottle rockets and Roman candles and M80s and M4s and it's insane. And he's running around the alleys with Roman candles shooting at each other. Don't do that! Oh, I could take it, but you couldn't, if that's what you're asking.
No, isn't there a place, I think it's on one of the reservations, where they just stand on the other side of the road and just shoot Roman candles at each other on New Year's?
That I don't know.
Somewhere.
But
Somewhere does.
so this shows about the taking of the land. I always thought that's a pretty good picture. And what about the children? Well, the children are going to have to be forced to be white. They called it Americanized. The Burke Act would create tribal schools. And these tribal schools would be where they would take, I mean, literally kidnap 4-year-olds and force them to these schools where they would not be allowed to leave and go back home. And they would be trained to be white. In fact, the saying in these schools, and the most famous was the Carlisle School in Oklahoma. A lot of these pictures of the propaganda, get it? Look, we're civilizing them. One of the sayings in these schools is, we'll beat the Indian out of them. And these were places of just horrific, brutal discipline. So they'd go there and they would try to erase every part of their old lifestyle. So if they spoke their old language, they'd be beaten. Wore any of the clothes or long hair of their style, or I remember talking about the Nez Perce, and then they'd have a pompadour haircut. And if they tried to wear that, they would be beaten severely, and they would be held there. And one more awful thing about these schools, they would also come in and they would find kids, especially they'd find the best, whatever that meant, but I'm sure it was horrifically racist. And they would take them and give them to white families. They would basically adopt. They would allow white families to adopt them, steal them even though they still have parents back home. So the idea being, well, we got to get them off the reservation. That's the only way they're going to survive. And that practice would go on until the 1970s. It's literally kidnapping little kids, saying, well, you're not fit parents because they're on a reservation. And this is years ago, 10, 15 years ago. I can't remember. Time starts to spread out the older you get. You'll find out. Oh, you find out. No, but there's a girl in my class, and this was in this classroom, it was APUSH history, and she was Cheyenne, really smart person, great student, but she told me about a little bit about this. But when I started talking about this, I don't have time to go into great detail, just the way it is. But we started talking, and she just all of a sudden must have hit everything she knew about it, and she had to leave. She was crying because it hit all the emotions. Because her grandma was 3 years old when she was kidnapped and taken to the St. Libre School. Back then, it was like an armed camp, and they'd lock them in, and they would beat her for anything. And the big thing she would do is she wanted to fight back, and she would wear a bead, just a bead, and hide it. And when they catch it, they would beat her. The two ways they would beat her would take a hickory switch, and either beat the bottom of her feet or the inside of her thighs. And she was just a massive bruise and scar. And that was one of those things okay, I told you this story. I know all of you are like, oh, that's horrible. I can't believe that. But when it was that personal to her, that meant, I don't know, it brought it more to home. It became less abstract. And she's in Billings now. She came here. That's one of the weird things. I do know that, but that really brought it home. That's a tough one. And I know now most of us are schools, but they're not quite the same. They're now just more like regular schools. Like the St. Libre School where her mom went is now it's just high school, elementary school. It's now the St. Libre. So the Cheyenne Lane here. And one more thing that's interesting: the Carlisle School, which was the most famous, supposedly the most successful Here's their band. So last night they had the national championship college football game, and I watched it. And I'm gonna be honest, I don't like the team, but I guess I wanted LSU. I hated LSU less than Clemson, so I guess. But they had the top 11 all-time football players for in college football history. They're on their 150th anniversary. You know, one of those things they do. And they had 11 of them out there. Most of them that are still alive were there, but they had the granddaughter of maybe the greatest athlete in American history. He was the number 3 all-time football player in college football history, they said. And it was Jim Thorpe. Some of you might have heard that name. And he went to Carlisle. He was kidnapped as a little kid, went to Carlisle. But he, you name it, he was great at it. Gold medalist, played football, basketball, baseball. Basically did everything. At a time when they weren't paid very well. But I just found that interesting, just as we're talking about it here. That was last night. His granddaughter was there. That was pretty amazing. We all know the best football player, right? No. Jim Brown. In the wake of removing American Indians to reservations, all this open land now was open for whites. And at first, many of the big cattle ranchers, they call it like the cattle kingdom, they just kind of took it. They didn't make land claims. And what they did is they just sent their cattle out and just, they call it open range. No fences, just go out and graze, and then in the spring, they'd round them up, whatever survived the winter. With the buffalo gone, now it's open. And there would be these big drives from Texas up north. And they would basically go, and they'd go into Mexico, rustle cattle, meaning steal cattle from Mexican farmers, and then bring them north. And that would be the seed cattle for ranches all the way through the plains, all the way up to Montana. Most famous would be the Goodnight Loving Trail, which went all the way up near Miles City. And there's a great work of fiction about them called Lonesome Dove, a very good show. So I'm not saying it's actually really good. But there'd be wars between the big cattle ranchers and sheep ranchers. Wyoming was infamous for the sheep ranchers fighting cattle ranchers for land. And have you ever heard of Billy the Kid? That was in New Mexico. And the cattle and the Lincoln County wars there. And this was a brief moment in time because homesteaders are coming in to take land, farm land, and the big ranchers were just, they're saying, we don't care, we're putting our cattle out there. What would change that would allow for smaller farmers and people to divvy up their land and cattle couldn't get through? 1879, what innovation? There might be a hint on this sheet.
Coffee grinder creating barbed wire.
Huh? Yeah.
Coffee grinder making barbed wire.
Coffee grinder?
Yeah, that's what he started it with.
Yeah, Joseph Glidden, yeah. Has anyone ever put up a barbed wire fence by hand? Anyone in here? Oh, you don't know. Fun. The best part is you're pulling barbed wire, and even though you have gloves on, you're pulling it, and then somebody tries to tighten it, and you're not ready for it. So it goes through your hand. Oh, that's the best feeling. You're alive. You're really alive. It's just blood. I took it. I don't know if the rest of you can do it. That's why my cheddar dog is one of the worst things I've ever done. That was one of those things I said, I'll do it for a week and get paid. It was God. Moving on. But barbed wire fences, they could now, homesteaders could fence off their land. And even though cattle, if you know anything about cattle, they can go through barbed wire fence, but they don't like it. So it holds them back. And so they can fence it off and divvy it up. And once that happened, pretty soon they're dividing up the land. And that's where you get more, even though there'll still be ranches, the big thing that hit the open range in Montana, before barbed wire really began to take hold, was the horrific blizzard of 86, 87. That winter, they would let the cattle out all winter and graze, and then they would round them up in the spring. Well, virtually all died, froze to death. And here is one of my favorite paintings. It's in Great Falls. And waiting for the Chinook from the 86, 87 winter with the wolf circling. That's a good painting. Who painted it? Yeah, C.M. Russell. And they have a lot of C.M. Russell paintings at the Historical Society, but has anyone been to the Museum of Great Falls? A few. It's really great. It's cool. And you get a chance to go to Great Falls. But it's a really cool museum. And that's a great painting. I like it. There's different elements, but it's cool that he's from Montana. And they divided up, and what about farmers? Well, the Homestead Act would be passed in 62. Lincoln would sign that on the same logic of the Transcontinental Railroad Act. And the whole point about that is you get 160 acres, a quarter section. And if you live there for 5 years and show an improvement, after 20 years, you get the land. So basically free as long as you show improvement. Now, speculators would cheat and get a bunch of this land, but the whole idea was for these small independent farmers, that old American dream. And this picture shows the problem that homesteaders have. This is in eastern Montana. I think you can see it. It's dry as a bone out there. There's no trees. What did they have to make their home out of? Sod. You cut sod and stack it up. Which is fun. When it rains, you get the mud coming off, and it has a great place for bugs and snakes to live in. See? Yeah, that's a tough life. And there's nothing to nail the roof on. You notice that? So they put rocks on the roof to hold it on. Tough life. So most of them didn't make it. They even doubled it to 320, but it was never enough. There was never enough. The reason why in the plains, at least at first, but now 160 acres is not enough anywhere. There wasn't enough rain. Here's another example of dry farming here. Maybe in Ohio, but it's approximately the 100 meridian, but they call it the rain line. And this area here, approximately somewhere in here, that's the limit of 20 inches a year. And if a farm doesn't get 20 inches a year, they can't make it consistently. They call that dry farming, and it's really hard. The only way to make it is you need a massive farm because your yields are going to be so low. And so essentially, for the most part, irrigation to make it on small plots. That's why almost all the homesteaders didn't make it. Almost all. The last big homesteading rush in Montana was in this area here. Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, South Dakota, during World War I. It rained a little bit more, kind of an aberration, and prices were high because of the war. When it crashed, they all lost everything. And they called this the rain line. But the thing was, railroads were coming through. And railroads wanted to convince people that, oh, no, it's a garden spot. Come in. And so they came up with a scientific argument, AKA sciencey, called rain follows the plow. And what they said was this. And here are advertisements for, this is the Burlington, Chicago Northwestern, the Milwaukee went through Montana, plowing up gold in Montana, people. And they would go to the East Coast, but they go to Europe and recruit people to move into the West so they have someone to use their railroad. And rain follow the plow is this. Look at cities where there's a lot of people. It also rains a lot. New York City, a lot of people, a lot of rain. London, a lot of people, a lot of rain. Paris, a lot of people, a lot of rain. So on. Why? It must mean that people and the activities of daily life, aka civilization, like plowing, causes rain. Think about it. They're plowing the field, dust goes up in the air. Smoke from fires or from factories go up in the air. What does that create? Clouds. Clouds rain, rain follows the plow. So the Santa Fe Railroad would actually have a map of Kansas, and they would say, look, the rain line just moved another 10 miles, moved to Kansas. And as we all know, that's true. That's what we call sciencey. Kind of science, right? Close enough. And people moved out there. That's why they recruited, they went to Scandinavia and recruited Scandinavians to go to Minnesota and say there'll be a garden spot. It's a lot lower, so it has to be nicer. They went to southern Germany, got a lot of Germans to come here. You ever wonder why the capital of North Dakota is called Bismarck? Named after the German chancellor? Or he's just like, oh, Bismarck sounds good. Yeah, because they're all a bunch of Germans. Just like Helena is named after a Confederate, an Arkansas town in Helena, Arkansas. There were a bunch of Confederates at first. And so with that, did it follow the plow? No, it didn't happen. And one thing that's going to tie this all together, first off, still the legend will persist. Did I mention Sitting Bull yesterday? Talk about what happened to him.
Yeah, he died.
Yeah. So Sitting Bull. Did I talk about him in the Buffalo Bills Wild West show? When he got back from Canada, after he fled after the Battle of Little Bighorn, he joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. He was a buffalo hunter who realized there's a lot more money selling the myth of the West. There were already, they called them dime novels, but little cheaply made books in the 1880s, 1890s about gunfighters and all these things, which were made up, not true. He took advantage of this. He hired a bunch of people who what we would call cowboys today, or a bunch of Lakota and Cheyenne. And even Sitting Bull went, and they went all around, big shows, all around, city to city in the East. They even went to Europe and portrayed the myth of the West. They would refight the Battle of Little Bighorn, just basically ride around and shoot guns in the air. And they had people like Andy Oakley who were trick shooters, and they come do shows, and they pushed this myth of the West. Sitting Bull hated the United States, but wanted to go see what the East was like. He agreed to go. And one funny story about Sitting Bull, his contempt for the United States was so strong that he knew all these people wanted to see Sitting Bull, and he would give him his autograph, even though it would be basically just a little extra kind of a symbol. And he would sell it for a dime, which was decent money back then. But he looked at it and he saw these people in the United States, and he thought all they care about, in fact, what he would say is their God is money. That's the only thing they care about. That's their God. And he would take every night, he would take that and go to the nearest outhouse, drop it all. I guess a way to fight back. If that's their God, I'll show you what I think of it. Well, this gave the myth. So when the first movies came out, here's Randolph Scott was a big Western actor. Westerns. TV and one of the singing cowboys, Roy Rogers. Selling Quaker Oats. And in the brand new Sears catalogs, you could buy 6-shooters and all that stuff and chaps. In fact, a lot of people from the cities going into the 20th century try to go into this mythology, and they would leave cities and go to these ranches, and they would act like a cowboy, dress in caps or cowboy hats and chaps, and they could act like cowboys. They had a name for them. They're called dude ranches, and that's a dude. A dude is somebody from the city who wants to act like a cowboy. That's where that comes from. And all that mythology hid the reality. What mattered? Industrialization conquered it, and now everybody's reliant upon crazy, freakish, long-legged Uncle Sam's and the railroad. And we got to tie it back into business growth, because all of it relied upon railroads and the development of monopolies, and a new world is being created while the old mythical West was still there. That's part of the reason why people look back at the West, because the world was being turned upside down by things like, here's the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific monopolies. They draw them as monsters. Beast. So, new heading, the second industrial revolution. We've already talked about the first one. So let's get quick into the factors of that. The first one, we're starting to get the world we knew. Remember I told you how we could understand 1860. You drop us into 1910, we'd be fine. There'd be a few technological things that'd be awkward, and bathing practices were different, but other than that, we'd be fine. So, what are the factors of this second industrial revolution? Well, it was built on the steam revolution. That first industrial revolution, the 1830s is when it really took hold up into the Civil War. And the basic new industries that based on it forms this wonderful acronym. What's the first big industry starting with T? Textiles. Remember textiles and cloth? What's R? Railroad. What's I? Iron. But it's industry. And what's C? The fuel?
Cool.
Coal. That's textiles, railroads, iron, and coal. Those are the first, that's the first industrial revolution. We're starting to see a world that makes sense to us. Not quite yet. Then the Civil War is like this dividing line. And the big thing about the Civil War was it set up new business practices. A new kind of businessman, we'll so-called robber baron. this entrepreneur that's totally different. And they're the ones who took advantage of government contracts, and then after the war, they took these practices to this new world. And that's why I have this both steam, but it's a dividing line. Here's a Union gunboat. See the cannon on the side? Kind of little bits of the old, but still about ready to be the new. And here's made by machines, wagons for the Army of the Potomac, right before the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864. So right on that edge. And then what happened after the war? Well, I don't know how I did this, but I don't want to change it because I'm just fascinated. They're white. You think, well, how did I do that? Now, I have no idea how I did this because I don't even know what I did. But I'm keeping it because I have this ghost-like labor behind. I have no idea what I did. But before we get to the second industrial revolution, what are the key industries? New acronym, R for railroads, but now a new fuel. O,
Oil.
oil. Huh?
Steel.
Steel, very good. Close. Electricity. And then C, chemicals. New chemical industry. Railroads, oil, steel, electricity, chemicals. And that is the new world, and that's our world. By the way, the chemical industry comes directly from the oil industry. Refining the oil, so many things that come from chemicals, everything from paint to aspirin comes from petroleum. So you think if you anybody take vitamins, petroleum. Your liver will thank you. But what else then? Labor. More workers. More workers, the number of available workers now, especially when skilled workers are being replaced by machines, and in the short run, if there's a surplus of workers, what does that do to wages? It drops them, so it made production possible. And at a time when it was most of the other industries buying industrial goods, this helped industry. Oh, made most workers' lives a living hell, but that's another story. Next, modern banking and finance. Modern banking and finance allowed these new businesses to borrow money to purchase the capital. And that is why sometimes you get people saying capital is money. Capital is not money unless you're a bank, but it allows you to purchase it. New industry, as industry becomes more technological, as that becomes more important, it becomes more expensive, and therefore access to credit is more important. Our entire business model, the entire United States, is built upon layer after layer after layer of debt. Somebody owes somebody else, somebody owes somebody. The whole thing is debt. Everything is debt. In fact, it would blow you away if you knew. That's one thing I'm doing second semester. I've been doing this now for a while, and I talk about the financial crash in 2008. Second semester of special topics. I go into detail, and they just can't believe the debt. They just can't believe it. And what happens is, that's one of the reasons why the economy can be pretty tricky. We have all these layers of debt. There's someone paying someone, paying someone, paying someone. If one of those layers, they can't pay back their debt, what happens to the entire economy? And that's what happened in 2008. And that will happen again, probably. That's of a risk. And, no, it will happen again. It will.
What layer can you pay back for that?
And that one?
Yeah.
It can stem from a couple different layers, but the biggie one was that houses were way overvalued. And so people borrowed too much money to buy houses in a real estate bubble. And when the bubble popped, they couldn't pay back their debt. And they built this entire layers of debt based upon that. It's just the whole economic system of the world collapsed. It was, in October of 2008, it was literally hair on fire panic. That's how bad it was. Good time. And you guys are lucky. You get to live through it again. See, there were controls on the New Deal, so that never happened, but we got rid of those. So I could experience it for my first time, too.
Did you not experience it in 2008?
Well, no, that was my first time in 2008.
Oh.
I was too young at 29. I was only in my 30s. So with that, next, the population market. Population goes up to, not only from labor, but with greater population, more demand. The market gets bigger. There's more production, and also more, it encourages more innovation. Just imagine, more things being sold. Immigration could have the short-term effect of dropping wages here. But at the same time, it increases the market dramatically. And overall, benefits the entire society. It's complex. I got like a thing sticking up on my head. I never noticed it until looking in the shadow. Like there's one piece sticking up right there.
We pointed it out a while
Huh?
ago. Amanda and I noticed it.
Why did you say something? Until you made me look like a fool. No, I just got that locker like, it's a nail on my head. Okay. Okay, next. Southern opposition to all these policies was gone. Remember, they fought against Whig policy for years. But after the Compromise of 1877, Southern politicians were basically, hey, do your pro-business policies, leave us alone in the South. And so that's going to open the door for this new, so you have all these little factors. But then let's get to the biggie. Probably the biggest time, the most dynamic time of 7, technological innovation. Probably the most dynamic time in history. And this is why I put Newton's quote. No, you don't have to know it, but it's a great quote. So remember, Newton wrote Principia Mathematica, and I mentioned this before, in the 17th century, where not only did he invent everybody's favorite subject, calculus, but he didn't actually invent it, but perfected it. What theory? Gravity, which I'm not sure is true. I mean, I'm convinced if I jump high enough, I'll just keep going. Yeah. We all do it together. I actually think it's a magnet. And there's a magnet in the center of the globe that just keeps it there by magnet. That's what some people in the 17th century believed. And the point is, Newton was not sitting in an ivory tower, pondering his navel. Oh, gravity! No, he built on the math and the work of other people. He built on that. He built on, where did that come from? His calculus came from Kepler, who's the one who figured out elliptical orbits. He did not invent it himself. So think about how innovation works. Nobody's going to invent a wheel until you have something to pull it with. No one's going to invent a light bulb until you have a constant power source. No one's going to invent a computer until you have the not only the power source, but the way to store memory and the way that you keep it cool, any number of things. Telephones don't work unless you have an amplifier. Once you have one bit of technology, and that allows technology to, oh, wait a second, we can branch off to more, and to branch off to more. This is the greatest time of technological innovation in the history of the world. Because we're coming to all this amazing innovation. People say it's today. No, it's then. Because virtually everything we need for survival is going to come out of this. Virtually everything. I know what you're thinking. No, wait. Well, first off, phones were invented here, but maybe not your cell phone. But I think most of you could survive without your cell phone. I said that word for there was a few like, no, I'd be gone. So with that, one of the biggie, the Bessemer process. The Bessemer process, the open heart. Anybody know what product they made? Steel. The Bessemer process right here took what was a very difficult, very skilled process by someone called a puddler, who would make steel by hand, and they would superheat iron, get the imperfections out. This would superheat large amounts of iron, dump out the imperfections, add a little bit more, and come up with high quality, relatively low cost steel. The open heart does it even a grander scale. And look at Pittsburgh with all the coal needed to fuel this. That's why they said Pittsburgh, because it's near the coal mines. That's why it's called the Steel City. Pittsburgh, in 1900, they say you could chew the air. You never saw the sun in Pittsburgh up until the 1960s. Never saw the sun. And the other story was that you would get a meal and have a plate. Before you could even pick up your fork, it'd be covered with a nice layer of soot. But don't worry, the soot had mercury and arsenic and cyanide in it because, vitamins and minerals. But steel would change everything. Think about steel. Taller buildings, stronger, lighter boats, planes. Steel would become the measure of industrial power. Steel. The United States made virtually no steel in 1870. By 1900, made more than the rest of the world combined. It made the power of the U.S. Steel. Then Germany started catching up, and then they would blow themselves up. So, refrigerated cars. Refrigerated cars. So having cars with freezers on refrigeration. I think, oh yeah, now we have coal. This changed everything. So they had the first steam-powered refrigeration back in the 1820s. But Gustavus Swift and Joseph Armour, Swift and Armour, meat packers. They're meat packers. And think about why this would be important for them. Before refrigerated cars, if you wanted something high protein like meat, and we need protein, where are you going to get it from? You have to either have to get it yourself, or there has to be a slaughterhouse or a butcher shop right there in your town. And they literally have to have they've been killed that day or the day before and eaten, or they start to rot. There's no refrigeration. They got to be eaten right away. And so they're going to be right in their town. There will be butcher shops where they're slaughtering animals. You can hear them scream to the whole thing right in your town, right next door. In fact, every place there would be rivers. And that's where the slaughterhouses would be. They just dump all the stuff into the river.
Alright, like train cars.
Yeah, train cars. That's the train car.
I totally thought you were kidding for like half
Yeah.
a I thought you meant like a refrigerator with wheels. I'm sorry.
What do I do? I work and I work. So, back to this though. I know it's right there!
I thought you were taking like a big joke.
Like John C. Calvin's like cousin or whatever.
His
His brother Raoul!
I thought it was like one of those.
Back to this. So production and food, and think about this for everything else. It'll go from isolated little areas. Now think about what's going to happen. It'll go from every town have to do it, or you have to do it yourself, to what can you do? You can centralize production. And therefore send all the animals to one spot where they can be slaughtered and packaged industrially. And then, I don't no, it's all industrial. Oh yeah, it's all done by machines. And then it's sent off around the country. What happens to all those little butcher shops and slaughterhouses in every little town? They're gone. What happens to stores and how you buy food? Once you're in refrigerated cars, you start seeing the shift to, instead of little tiny markets, to more of a grocery store. Soon, especially once you get cars, what do you get? Supermarkets. And all the little stores go away. And then what happened even to the big supermarkets? They're not going away for even bigger stores. And what we have with this is, not only changed the entire way we ate, everything, it led to just a few companies doing everything. Consolidation. How many companies today control 90% of all the food in the United States? How many companies? You want to know?
3.
4.
What are they? What are they?
It's what is it? Nabisco, Medexco.
Sodexo?
Not Sodexo. Sodexo.
I don't know any of
That's another one. But that's a food service. They buy their food from them. Coca-Cola, General Mills, and God, what's the other one? There's another one. God, it's huge. It'll pop into my head in a second, but just a few.
Will you go over Swift and Armour?
There were 2 meat packers who did that. And they were the first ones who invented. They didn't invent it, but they invested in it. And everything changed. I mean, think about it now. Where do we get our food? It just appears. And do we even know what's in it?
Not always.
Do you think they tell us? No. If you don't believe me, look at the ingredients label. Not only do they not have to put everything that's in there, but we don't even know what half of that stuff means. Look at a bag of Doritos. Talk about chemical industry. What did Alexander Graham Bell invent?
Telephone.
No way!
I did my reading.
But there were 8 different inventions he built.
Remember that? Really, right? Your blonde was coming through.
You make it work. Okay!
That took us so much. Why do you think I would leave the refrigerator full?
I was kind of wondering why people are giving me weird looks. Yeah. Whatever. Yeah, get over here. You have a job to do.
And I was thinking that I should warn you.
Bro, Chileans of water.
I need my phone. Like, I need to talk to you. Yeah, exactly. Like, I wrote on the heading, but I wasn't believing it. I really thought I would get that.
I knew you.
I knew I would. Do you want to ask me, Chad? For me? Absolutely. Yes, I need to be one.
The fact that it just launches things at people's ears.
So you're pretty good that way.
Yeah. Do you understand my mission? Who? Anderberg.
Oh, you mean Carl?
Carl Anderberg.
Fun fact, did you tell him when you said he did his powers?
He's a weird guy and an awful teacher. His wife.
That's not the best. Eat, move away.
Question.
Okay, I did right. You know what? They just said that. Yeah.
Dress up day is tomorrow.
The Iranians, here's what they warned you so nobody would get killed. To be honest with you,
lying till they die.
who knows what would happen. They had to retaliate, but then they freaked out, shot down one of their own planes. So. Oh, I haven't decided yet, but I really just.
Oh, okay.
I really have not. But if I do, there would only be 10 things.
Okay.
Individual trees. You have to identify which one. I think I need. Don't be like this.
I'll try to let him flow.
I have an Apple Watch.
Yes, look right here.
There'll be some I couldn't talk
Vietnam
about.
map. Literally, we would trade. Did you give us already?
I put a few criminals, I put a few conspiracy, most of it would be matched. And remind me on Friday, I'll give you most of it would be
It's not for long, so we're not really
How many points is it?
I don't know, it's gonna be worth about 30% of your grade.
Alexander Graham Bell.
But don't worry, 30% of your grade. I mean, you would have to do really, really bad to hurt it. 30% is not that much. If it was half your grade, that would start.
No, but if I'm gonna be on Friday, how will I know which one's to do?
If you don't pass, if you don't get 100%, you will fail. Probably every class. I'm gonna go back and I'll change your grades as a freshman. I'll go back to junior high grades. They don't even matter.
Okay, I will be
They'll
here.
follow you for the rest of your life.
I will be here Thursday, Friday, because I'll be getting my wisdom teeth out.
Huh?
Getting my wisdom teeth out Thursday.
Oh, we can do that in class. I'll give you 5 points extra credit if we do it in class.
No, like we
Pull
personally.
her hair back. It makes it a lot easier.
I
have a.
Don't bring my extra chop.
I have a chisel. That's how they use it.
I was away from my because I have such bad anxiety that they kept going and giving me more, and then I heard them go, I can't give her any more, and they're like, all right, sure, and I felt it all.
Did it hurt, or was it more just a?
It was like, I felt crashing. Oh, that is bullshit. And then I think that's when I was like, oh, I just got my feelings.
I still have mine. I feel the rim.
I wouldn't go to sleep.
Yeah, I still have mine.
I remember sometimes people would be having they give me like 6 shots. Yeah, I can still feel it. I just keep on taking people. So I was like, whatever.
No, those are the tricks.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what else to call it. I typed down dirty tricks.
Emily was like, yeah, your job is it.
Oh, okay, so on Friday, if we're done with the laws, I'm talking a little bit about Bachman. And that's when we're talking about how you use heroin in kids. Yes.
This is a 1,000th time.
Maybe 25. Yeah, I do it. APUSH history is 30%. 40?
I'm thinking 70.
70% of your ground. My original.
This is the only grade we ever.
I heard that about that. You're not. And you got a very solid A. You would have even 30% doesn't hurt. But I want to make it enough that, let's say, you know, we're not getting 88 next year, or like a 90. You have to do well. I want to make it enough. Really, 30% is not that much. If it's 50%, then it would have a. Yes. And I'll try to remember. I
Okay,
really
all
will.
of mine do like 35.
Yes. Huh? I don't think you have that skill set. Okay, so let's go ahead. Oh, we got 30 seconds, guys. I'm still recording this.
Really?
Yeah.
Boogers.
Yeah, that's the extent of your humor. That's about as in-depth as it gets. Yeah, that's about it. It's not quitting.
Wait, are we talking about watching?